Merci, Madame Poisson. Vous avez raison de dire que l'Observatoire et la journée d'aujourd'hui témoignent d'une mobilisation intersectorielle extraordinaire. Je vais prendre quelques minutes pour vous présenter le programme à grands traits et vous donner quelques consignes pour la journée. Donc, ce matin, immédiatement après ma petite intervention, on se lance dans l'analyse des impacts des fermetures scolaires sur les apprentissages et les stratégies pour les atténuer. Il y aura 3 présentations de 20 minutes. Tout ça va être suivi d'une pause de 15 minutes. Vous allez voir pourquoi je ne m'appelle pas Lagarde pour rien. Après la pause, il y aura une table ronde. Et les tables rondes de ce matin, cet après-midi, l'idée, c'est d'avoir des regards croisés en impliquant des gens terrain, en contact direct avec les enfants, des gens qui sont à proximité des enfants, mais aussi des chercheurs et d'autres acteurs qui œuvrent à différents paliers, dans différentes instances, qui peuvent adopter des politiques publiques, des mesures plus systémiques. Alors, ça va être très intéressant, avec un filtre intersectoriel, et des inégalités d'inclusion et d'approches différenciées pour répondre aux besoins. Alors, on va discuter de ces choses-là. Il y aura un dîner de midi à 13h30 et en après-midi, là, on va aborder un peu avec la même approche, d'abord les impacts et les stratégies, ainsi que les mesures préventives en lien avec la COVID-19 sur les habitudes de vie, la prévention des maladies, et on va aborder aussi des questions de santé mentale. Il y aura aussi une table ronde avec une combinaison, encore une fois, de regards variés. Là, mon message à tout le monde, incluant aux conférenciers, et en se rappelant qu'il y a des gens en provenance de 11 pays avec des fuseaux horaires très variés, il va être très important de respecter l'horaire parce que les gens vont revenir selon ce qui est dit. Alors, je vais jouer au chien de garde un peu, puis je vais même permettre aux conférenciers de vous rappeler qu'il vous reste 3-4 minutes, puis je vais vous demander de respecter ça. Aussi, je vais demander aux gens dans la salle, quand vous allez intervenir pour poser des questions ou vous exprimer sur un sujet durant les tables rondes, d'attendre d'avoir un micro. Pascal Dubé, si elle peut, elle est là, va se promener avec un micro. C'est très important que tout le monde parle à un micro parce qu'il y a 250 personnes qui ne vous entendront pas si vous parlez sans le micro. Pour les gens à distance, vous pouvez vous manifester dans la section discussion, chat sur Zoom. Encore une fois, Pascal va vous surveiller, colliger et être le relais de vos questions ou commentaires. Je vous avertis qu'il y a 3 conférences durant la journée qui vont être en anglais sans traduction simultanée. 2 ce matin, 1 cet après-midi. Le choix a été fait de ne pas, un choix budgétaire notamment, de ne pas avoir de traduction simultanée. Voilà. Alors, si vous êtes prêts, on se lance avec la série de 3 conférences sur les impacts sur les apprentissages. La première intervenante, Carla Haelermans, qui nous parle de Maastricht ce matin. Elle est professeure d'économie et de l'éducation à l'Université Maastricht aux Pays-Bas et détentrice de la chaire de recherche Capital humain, technologie éducative et inégalité, en plus d'être la coordonnatrice nationale de l'étude de cohorte néerlandaise sur l'éducation, communément appelée NCO. Alors, je laisse la technique opérer. Quand vous êtes prête, allez-y.
Hello? Yes.
Welcome.
This seems to work.
Showtime.
Good. Then thank you for the nice introduction. And let me share my screen so you can... There we go. I cannot see you anymore, so I hope you can see my screen now. If I don't hear anything, I'm assuming that's correct. Well, I said thank you for the nice introduction. Thank you also for the invitation for the presentation here in a nice digital way. I mean, I think if there is one thing that well, COVID has taught us is that doing conferences in this way, inviting people all over the world to give a digital presentation, well, that works quite well. I think that's one of the good things. But of course, well, for education, there are a lot of downsides as well. That's what I will talk about today. As the introduction already said, my name is Carla Haelermans. I'm a professor in education economics at Maastricht University. And what I will present here is joint work with a lot of my colleagues who work with me in the project of the Netherlands cohort study on education, which is abbreviated as NCO. And the presentation today is about the inequality and the effects of primary school closures in the Netherlands due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And what I will present is updated evidence from the Netherlands. Okay, 1 second, it won't go to the next slides. There we go. So given that your whole conference is about the effects of COVID, I'm probably not telling you anything new when I say that due to the pandemic, worldwide learning was interrupted for many, many children, and there were many school closures in various countries. And at some point, there were 168 million students worldwide who were at home and not in school for over a year. And at the same time, there were, even in the countries where there was internet and a lot of technology, large challenges with distance learning, with access to learning devices, with focus and motivation of children when they were at home trying to learn. As soon as the pandemic started, also research started, worry started first about what's the pandemic doing to the development of children, the learning of children. And then research obviously also emerged to unfortunately show that especially this first period of the pandemic was really detrimental for the learning gains of students. And there was quite some evidence from the Netherlands, from Belgium, also Christophe de Witte, who will be one of the next speakers, also already back then showed the detrimental consequences for learning gains of students. But not just that. Studies looked further to show that after a full year of the crisis, there were still quite big learning losses, and they were unfortunately not evenly distributed. The learning losses were the largest for children that were already disadvantaged, that have a low socioeconomic status, an unstable family situation, or come from a large family, for example. So there are quite some indications from research that the inequalities that were already existing before the whole COVID pandemic started have actually increased during the pandemic. And there is some evidence from other studies, for example, in the Netherlands, that also showed that low educated parents felt less able to help their children at home with their homework. But also in the UK, where there is a study that shows that working class parents spend less time with their children on homeschooling than middle class parents. That was all what we've learned about this first year of the pandemic. Well, unfortunately, as we all know, we like to pretend it's over, but it isn't. It's still around. But especially in this second year of the pandemic, many countries, and the Netherlands, what I'm talking about, for sure, they in education basically stepped out of the crisis mode and tried to go back to normal. But it wasn't back to normal. The virus was still there, especially in the beginning with the regulations that we had. Students were sent home all the time when they had a cold. When there were a couple of students affected within a class, a whole class was sent home. And at some point, even complete schools were closed for a couple of weeks because of the virus. So there was a contradictory situation where, on the one hand, we tried to go back to normal, teaching the normal curriculum, doing all the things schools usually do in education. At the other hand, the virus still being there, interrupting education continuously. And at the same time, there were provided by our government additional funds and also additional focus on these learning losses. So there was a lot of things going on in the second year of the pandemic. And the question is also, well, additional to the knowledge we have about this first year, that learning was really lower than before, there were learning losses. The question is, what did the second year of pandemic do to the learning of students? And also, quite importantly, what did it do to inequality between students? So that's what the study that I'm talking about here is looking into. How do 2 years of COVID-19 affect the learning gains of primary school students, but also are there differences between this first and the second year, which had quite different circumstances? And the question keeps, we keep asking the question what the inequality is and the effect of this pandemic on learning by student background. Well, what kind of data do we use to analyze these questions? We use quite unique Dutch standardized test data from primary education, from tests that are compulsory for schools to take, for all the children to take twice a year. And these test data, these unique test data that are written twice a year, are linked to extensive student, school population, and school background data, such that we can look into these inequalities. We have more than a third of all Dutch primary schools included in the data, so it's quite a representative sample. And as I already referred to previous research, this is a fourth update of analysis that we do. So every half a year, there comes new data because a new test was written, and we provide an update with the Netherlands cohort study on education. This is already a fourth update on that. Well, what do we contribute with this study on top of what we already know? In the beginning, I referred to some literature, some studies that emerged after the first 4, 5, 6 months of the pandemic. What do we still contribute? Well, the richness of the data, the very precise measures of the student background are really a contribution over what we already have out there in studies, but also really one of the first studies to very precisely measure background of students and assess the heterogeneous effects of these 2 years. And I have personally not seen a study before that looks at this first and second year of pandemic separately. So that's another contribution. So what's the research setting in Dutch primary education? Well, we're talking about grades 1 to 6, which in the Netherlands is age 6 to 12. We have primary and secondary education strictly separated. So children really move schools after primary education. And in primary education, they write these standardized tests twice a year. Once a midterm test, which is usually taken in January, February, and once an end of the year test, which is usually taken in May or June. And below on this slide, you see the timeline of these 2 years of COVID. And because the COVID pandemic started in, well, at least in the Netherlands in March, the timeline also basically starts in March. But the good thing about these standardized tests that are taken twice a year is that these tests were just taken before the pandemic hit us. So that's a perfect pre-measure of the state of affairs of students' learning. And then in March, all of a sudden, over a weekend, schools had to close. On Friday, it was decided, as of Monday, the country is going into a full lockdown. Everything will close, including schools, basically for everyone. And eventually, very, very vulnerable children were allowed to come to school. But in the beginning, it was really closed for everyone. That was for about 8 weeks. And then schools were only partly allowed to reopen. That is, schools were open, but children were only allowed to go for about 50% of the time. And it was up to schools to see how they would organize that. If they would let children come half days, 5 days a week, or full days, but only every other day. There was a lot of flexibility there, but in practice, it boiled down to children going to school only for 50% of the time. And during the school closure and this partly school closure, schools try to organize a lot to provide some distance learning, but they were having a hard time. And it's not easy if you're not used to that to all of a sudden change things to doing it in a digital way. Keeping in contact with the children. I talked to a lot of schools, a lot of teachers, and it basically was a mess, unfortunately. Then there was a summer break. In the first summer of the COVID year, we all thought, I think, the virus was gone. So the next school year in September started normally, but then the virus came back, and we had another second school closure, which was started halfway December 2020, and that lasted until beginning of February. And so I said before that this midterm test is usually taken in January or February, but because of the school closure, it was delayed in this in 2021. So it was not taken in January, but it was in many cases belated by about 6 weeks. But there is some variation between schools in how much later the tests were taken, and for the results that I will show you later, we control for this. Then again, there was this partly going to school period, which really lasted the rest of the school year, from halfway February to the end of June. Sometimes there were full classes at school, but in most cases, it was still part of the class. And then again, in summer, it all seemed more or less over. In September, we tried to go back to normal, pretended like nothing happened, went back to the normal curriculum. But again, because of the increasing infection rates, the quarantine rules, there was often no class, or children had to miss school. Schools were closed completely, as I said before. So it was really disrupted learning. And then the government decided to have a 1 week early Christmas holiday for schools. And schools then continued to be regularly open, more or less, as of January. The tests were taken in a normal time frame, January/February. And that was the test 2 years after the midterm test that was accidentally taken right before the pandemic happened. So this is a timeline of the the disruptive education that the children in primary education in the Netherlands had in these 2 years of COVID. There were 2 full school closures, but there was a lot of interruption and chaos in the periods in between and after the school closures as well. Well, what kind of data do we have? I already said we have data from 36% of the Dutch primary schools, from the standardized test administration system that schools are obliged to have. We can go back in the data until 2013, so we can also look at pre-pandemic years to see what a normal learning growth would be for a certain grade level, and compare that with how children do in these COVID years. So we have about 500,000 unique students, and in the analysis, we have about 1 million observations with 2,200 schools, and we include grades 1 to 5 for reading, spelling, and mathematics, where we use data from one test supplier who supplies both the midterm and the end-term test. And that we link to the Netherlands Cohort Study and Education data with a lot of school information, but also data from Statistics Netherlands, who provides background variables for the students. Well, I already said in the beginning that we, on the one hand, we want to know what's the state of affairs after 2 years of pandemic. And on the other hand, we'd like to know, is this first year of the pandemic different from the second year in how students develop? So for the first question, what's the state of affairs after 2 years? We look at the learning growth of students over 2 years. So if a student was in grade 4 right before the pandemic hit, the student will be in grade 6 now. What was the learning growth between the midterm test in grade 4 until the midterm test in grade 6? That's how we look at this learning growth over 2 years. And what we do is we compare this 2-year COVID period with 2 cohorts from before COVID. So the period from the midterm in the 2016/17 school year until the 18-19, and the midterm test written in the 2017/18 school year until the midterm 19/20, which again was right before the pandemic hit. And we compare that with the 2 years since the pandemic. And we look at the grade levels at the start of the pandemic from 1 to 4, because grade 6 is the latest level in primary education. So if you were in grade 4 when the pandemic started, you're in grade 6 now, and there is no later year in primary education. And know that for reading, we only can do 2 to 4 because we don't have midterm grade reading tests in first grade.
Carla, you have
Yes.
5 more minutes.
That's good, because I'm going to the results now. And for the analysis where we compare the 2 different years, there we also need 2 cohorts from before the pandemic. We do it in a similar way. Good to mention before I present the results that you already see on this slide is that we standardize our analysis. So we don't use the scores that they get for the tests in the Dutch grading system, but we really standardize them in an international way. So that's what you also see in these results. They are standardized and presented in terms of standard deviations. And also good to mention is that we take into account the school structure. So we cluster standard errors at the school level, and we take into account the variation in how much later schools have taken this test in the school year that the schools were still closed in the regular period. Well, this is a slide on the results from 2 years into the pandemic on learning gain. And so we see on the left-hand side the unstandardized results for the 3 domains, where the left pillar bar is the period from before the pandemic, and the right is since the pandemic. And on the right-hand side, we see that in a standardized way. I'm only going to focus on the right-hand side figure here, where we see that for reading after 2 years, and remember, it's 2 years into the pandemic, but also a lot of extra money made available, more focus by schools, the acknowledging the detrimental effects of the crisis in the beginning, so putting extra effort in to bring children back to the regular level. And for reading, we see that over those 2 years, the learning growth is more or less back to normal. However, for spelling and mathematics, that's not at all the case yet. For spelling and mathematics, the lower learning growth after these 2 years being into the pandemic is about 0.25 standard deviations, which is roughly 8 to 10 weeks on a school year. So it's definitely not nothing. The question then is, how do we see, I mean, you would expect on the one hand, with all the extra money and attention, that in the second year, we would catch up some of the losses that were established in the first year. On the other hand, knowing how chaotic the second year was, maybe that's not a very fair expectation. So what if we look at the 2 years separately? That's what we see in this slide. And again, I'm only going to focus on the right-hand side of the results. And for reading, we definitely see that. There was some learning loss in the first year, but that was much, much lower in the second year. So there we see that children are catching up. But for spelling and for mathematics, especially for mathematics, that's worrisome. We see that the learning growth is even lower compared to regular years, pre-pandemic years, in the second year than in the first year. So where we would expect that children would actually catch up some of the learning loss they established in the first year, it even became worse in this second year. And that's what this figure showed. Now, I also said in the beginning that the pandemic has really increased inequality. So what if we look at that? What if we look at the, again, back to this the situation after 2 full years of pandemic, so not splitting up the 2 years, but the total period. We see that for reading, after 2 years, the differences between the 3 groups by parental education, low parental education, middle and high parental education, is very similar. So there the inequality that we saw before, as well, the part that was caused by the pandemic has more or less stabilized. But for spelling and mathematics, we still see 2 years into the pandemic, despite extra attention, that children from low-educated parents are hit much harder by the pandemic than other children. So, to conclude and wrap up and hopefully stay within time, what we see with these analyses, where we look at the situation 2 years into the pandemic, looking at the full period of 2 years, but also looking at the 2 separate years, we see that the average learning loss of the 2 years is still 0.2 of a standard deviation, which is 8 weeks of a school year, but it's mostly in spelling and mathematics. For reading, it seems to be quite fine again in the Netherlands. There are also still inequalities in learning loss, mostly by parental education. But if we compare the results we have now with what we had, after 1 year of pandemic, we do see that the inequality has decreased a bit. So it's still there, but it's lower than it was after this first period of school closure. What we also see is that, especially for spelling and mathematics, the second year learning loss is not lower than the first year. So we're still at the same level of awareness that we need to work on these learning losses. So despite the fact, also what I just said, that inequality has decreased, the inequality that was caused by the pandemic has decreased a bit in this second year. It's not gone, but it's lower than it was before. Still, vulnerable students are really hit the hardest by the pandemic. And some catching up is good news for reading, that is. Results for spelling and mathematics are still quite alarming. And it's actually even possible that this second year of COVID was more disruptive, because we did pretend the pandemic was gone. We did go back to normal, try to step out of crisis mode, teach the regular curriculum, but it wasn't normal. So that was probably even more disruptive for children's learning than this crisis mode we had in the first year. And another part of the discussion is that it's worrisome that the differences between types of students and schools are still quite big. I now presented only the results for parental education, but we looked at several different student background characteristics, and there's still large differences to be seen. There are some strategies put in place to recover: targeted interventions for vulnerable groups, catch-up programs. A colleague of mine is looking into that, and they do show positive effects for those vulnerable students, but still not enough to close the gap in inequality. There's a national program with additional funds that are really disproportionately allocated to schools with a higher share of vulnerable students. The government provided a roadmap with evidence-based interventions. And recently, we got the news that the period in which these additional funds can be spent is extended, because, of course, the pandemic is extended, unfortunately. So there's a lot of things our government is trying to do, and that schools are working on. But I think there is still, unfortunately, a long way to go. And I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.